Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. It's entitled, How Did I Miss That? Why SOC Analysts Might Overlook Evidence in a Threat Investigation. My name is Dave Branscombe. I am a Microsoft employee of 15 years. I'm based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I love security certifications. I take as many security certifications as I possibly can and that I can fit into my schedule. So feel free to contact me about your security certification questions. I'm glad to answer them. My blog is listed there, www.cloudyhappypeople. I write on topics related to Microsoft security for Microsoft 365 and Azure and so on. So I'm happy to hear from anybody. So let's get into it. Let's talk first about the danger of missed signals from a security perspective. Now, all of us remember the story of Pearl Harbor, right? Just as dawn was breaking on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese fleet struck the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, the naval base in Pearl Harbor was completely unprepared for battle, even though the United States had already managed to break Japanese diplomatic code in the lead up to that date. And the military attaché in Washington or in Java had warned Washington of a planned Japanese attack on Hawaii, the Philippines, and Thailand a week earlier, but the signals were missed. What about the collapse of the Soviet Union? So conventional wisdom tells us that the United States intelligence community failed to predict the Soviet Union's demise back in 1991, even though there were a number of signals that pointed to that actually happening. We saw the reforms of President Mikhail Gorbachev. We saw the deteriorating Soviet economy, the collapse of communism in East and Central Europe. All these things were indicators that the Soviet Union was collapsing, but the indicators are that people were caught by surprise. The third one is the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11. So even the investigators who could see the outlines of a bigger conspiracy didn't really have support from the highest levels of government. They didn't receive the time, the funding, the support that they needed to perform a full investigation and a threat analysis. So there were the attacks on the embassy in Tanzania and in Kenya, the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in October 2000, and all these things led up to the attacks on 9/11. So the problem isn't that there weren't any signals in these cases pointing to the events. The signals were there, but they weren't seen for what they eventually proved to be. They were missed, they were misinterpreted, or in some cases, they were simply minimized. Now, we see the same thing happening over and over again to the companies that we work for, the companies that we work with. In many cases, there are signs of an impending attack. Sometimes we even have attacks that are in progress. And yet the signals are missed, they're misinterpreted, they're minimized, just like the ones that we saw on the slide before. In fact, most of the tools and the techniques that are used by attackers are very well known. And in many cases, they're quite noisy and they're very easy to identify. So the question becomes, how are these signals missed? So there's a good example of how that happened in the case of the Quanta Computer Company. They're based out of Taiwan and they make hardware and different components for a lot of the big tech companies, including companies like Apple and Microsoft. So in April 2021, the REvil ransomware gang revealed that they had actually accessed and exfiltrated a large amount of Apple's proprietary data, including some of the blueprints and schematics for the latest Apple Watch, the latest iPad, the latest iPhone, MacBooks, and they made the demand that Apple pay a ransom if they don't want that data to be put out on public forums. Now, this was a bad situation, but it wasn't one that couldn't have been predicted. So a company called Black Kite Security ran some evaluations against Quanta's infrastructure in the year prior to the event that we're talking about here. And they gave Quanta an F, a failing grade in the areas of things like patch management, credential hygiene, application security. And you can see that they got poor grades in some of the other areas as well. So setting up SSL and information protection and email security. So think about this. If you were one of the SOC team members at Quanta Computer Company, how would that make your job more difficult? It means that you have to watch so many more areas, and attackers have so many more options to penetrate your environment. And that's exactly the point that's being made in this illustration. So the attackers are going to find the gaps, the seams in your network, and they can do a lot of damage once they find those gaps. You may have pretty decent coverage in one area. Maybe your email hygiene systems are really good, but if an attacker is able to slip through and then move on to an endpoint and then maybe move laterally from endpoint to endpoint, you may lack the ability to observe or alert on that movement. And so the attacker goes invisible and you have to find them somewhere else all over again. So the question is, why does it happen? Well, as they say, hindsight is 2020. So it may be easier from our perspective to look back at Pearl Harbor, to look back at 9/11 and say, well, these are the exact signals that were missed. And if someone had noticed these specific things, things might have turned out differently. But you have to remember, we're doing that from the vantage point of knowing exactly how things turn out and knowing which signals were important and how they all fit together. At the time, however, the indicators that people were working with were not the only things that were vying for their attention, right? They were just one signal in a sea of signals. So it only became obvious once it became obvious. And that's the challenge that our SOC teams are dealing with. After the breach, putting the puzzle pieces back together is a lot easier than putting the pieces together before the breach. Before the breach, it's like they've been given 500 different puzzles and all the pieces are dumped into a pile and they're told that one of them is going to create a treasure map for them. So the SOC team has to sort through this pile of puzzle pieces and try to figure out which puzzle pieces matter and what the puzzle picture even is supposed to look like in the end, right? After the breach, it's like they've been given the box, right? Where you have the picture of the puzzle on the box. And so you know this is the important puzzle and this is what the map is supposed to look like in the end. And you can work backwards from there. It's still not the easiest thing in the world, but it's a lot easier than where they started, not knowing specifically what they're looking for. Now, that can be extremely exhausting, and it creates what we know as SOC alert fatigue. So most SIMs and threat management systems are able to log millions upon millions of events, maybe producing thousands of alerts each day. But even with all the automation that you might build into your SIM and the efforts that you put into filtering out the noise, there are always alerts that are going to require a human's brain to interpret and to apply problem solving abilities to in order to track down. So when you couple that with things like overwork, a lack of clear guidelines on what to do when certain things are found, um, the number of reoccurring alerts and false positives, all these help an attacker to accomplish their objectives. So what does a SOC need? If you think about the basic requirements of a SOC, a couple things that they need in order to be successful are visibility across the environment. So they need to have coverage across all the endpoints in their environment. You can't have gaps that allow an attacker to kind of wedge their way into your environment and hide while they plan their next move. You have to have accurate information about the environment. In other words, what systems do you have? What's your IP addressing scheme? What software is available on the systems? What shouldn't be available on systems, and things like that. The third point is you need automation that can generate meaningful alerts as well as act on those alerts where possible. And the reason for that is that you want to take the burden off of humans to respond to every single alert, right? You want to make it possible for the standard, typical, frequently seen type of alerts to be handled in an automated way. The fourth point is having good quality threat intelligence feeds. You want to have the latest information about what's a malicious IP address, which machines are connected to a botnet, what's a malicious file, and so on. And last but not least, the humans in the SOC need to be well trained. They need to know how to identify and remediate threats in the environment. So, what are the problems that we encounter that create obstacles to those goals? Problem number one is that in many cases, the role of the SOC primarily becomes that of just passively monitoring, observing, and then responding. So it's a purely reactive, defensive mechanism for the organization. So even though we do see many SOC teams that do some threat hunting, and that is a somewhat proactive action by the SOC team, most SOCs primarily act in a reactive way. It may be triggered by an alert. It might be triggered by some suspicious or abnormal activity, whatever it is, but they're reacting to that thing. Now, we've probably heard the expression that the best defense is a good offense. And that's why conducting things like penetration tests, running red teams, other offensive security exercises, doing phishing, searching for voice phishing, right? Vishing, that all should be vital for any organization. The reason is that tests the muscles of the SOC team, and it can help to contribute to the overall security posture of the entire infrastructure. The second problem that we run into is that in a SOC, everything is dependent upon being able to quickly respond to events or alerts. So if an important event comes in, it's important that the SOC team can see it as soon as possible and that there are analysts ready to respond to that alert or to that threat. That's in the ideal case, right? In the real world, there are going to be delays in the workflow that could be caused by things like events arriving late into the SIM. Sometimes it can be, 20 seconds, but it could also be as long as 10 to 20 minutes, depending on, log aggregators and congestion in flows and things like that. It could take a long time, and that allows attackers to have a head start. There may also be a backlog of unhandled incidents, alerts that are pending attention by an analyst. And like email, right? When you have your email box open in the morning, there's things that are up at the top of that email box. And then as the day goes by, they slowly make their way to the bottom of your email inbox. And maybe they fall out of sight, out of mind, right? So the same thing with alerts in a SOC. They may just drop down to the point where they don't get addressed, even though they should. The third problem, nobody's perfect. We are always going to make mistakes. No SOC is going to be able to save your environment if your systems administrators leave the systems unpatched, if the systems are misconfigured, if they're protected by weak or default passwords, right? So if it's username admin, password admin, it's only a matter of minutes before some attacker is going to compromise that device. So the purpose of the SOC, to be clear, is not to go around and conduct penetration testing of the infrastructure, and they're not supposed to do assessments, right? There are other teams, there are operational teams that have those responsibilities. The SOC team is there to monitor, observe, and respond to malicious activity. But if the environment is already so broken and so full of vulnerabilities because of unpatched systems, threats that are not being mitigated, the SOC is only going to be able to do so much in defending it because the number of alerts they're going to get is just going to be overwhelming. Things are going to go bad eventually. Problem number 4. One thing that's often the case with the SOC is that they have to operate with limited information about the environment that they're protecting. So this is often because individual groups get territorial, right? They don't want to share information about their infrastructure with the SOC team. So for example, they may not share currently updated network diagrams. They may not want to share a list of firewall rules or conditional access rules. Do they have a list of um, the important assets that exist within the network? Did the CEO get a new laptop? Does the HR director have a new phone? Right? These are things that are important to the SOC to know so that they can tag those devices as being important or being sensitive. But if they don't have that information, then it's just another device in a sea of devices. What is the correct naming scheme for the environment? So how will they know if something doesn't belong if they don't know what correct looks like, right? If you've got a naming scheme for your environment, but that's not conveyed to the SOC, how will they recognize when an attacker brings in their own device and joins it to the network and starts performing their activities? So when the organization team members don't provide accurate, up-to-date information to the SOC team, it makes their job harder. And the few extra minutes that it might take to try to figure out the answer to these questions can mean the difference between catching the attack before something bad happens and potentially, a full domain compromise. One of the key components of every SOC is also having a high quality threat intelligence feed, having a good curated list of indicators of compromise. So there are many places where those can be captured, many industry well-known feeds from different industry sources. So the FBI InfraGard has good lists of IOCs. The SANS Internet Storm Center has good intelligence. There's various ISACs that can also be leveraged to do that. So most organizations don't have the manpower to have their own threat intelligence um, collection gathering arm of their SOC. So in the absence of that, the organization needs to find feeds, maybe they're paid feeds, perhaps they're free feeds, but they need to get that information from somewhere so that they have the latest information about how attacks are being performed and what the indicators are that they should be looking for to find those. Problem number 6 is I can't see anything, right? So lack of visibility is another one of the more difficult challenges that many SOC teams face. So for instance, SOCs often don't have complete visibility into things as simple as encrypted communication, right? So if traffic is going across a TLS or SSL channel, they can't see into that into that traffic flow. Some organizations will do things like perform SSL inspection on the edge of their network, but that doesn't cover all the encrypted information or communication that's taking place internally between the systems on the internal network. And to achieve something like that is in many cases practically impossible. to do decryption and re-encryption between every system on the internal network. Lateral movement is another area that can create challenges in some environments. Because there are so many endpoints in many environments, and there are so many kinds of traffic being exchanged between those devices, not just encrypted traffic, but just any kind of traffic, it can be really hard to discern what's good and normal and distinguish it from the kind of quiet and nefarious types of traffic that might indicate an attacker. And then endpoint visibility is another limitation that many SOCs face. So what they usually have is things like antivirus alerts from their Windows-based endpoints, but that's not enough. What they need are the pieces of information that make it possible for them to do threat hunting, including things like, what are the other endpoints? What are the servers, the IoT devices, the network devices, the appliances, mobile devices that exist and that are participating in that network? Um, and these are the areas where attackers can make an inroad to the environment and potentially compromise it. And one of the last things that we're going to talk about here is um, you have to give your SOC team members, whether they're analysts, whether they're threat hunters, whether they're building threat intel feeds, whatever it is, they have to have sufficient time away from dealing with alerts and let them focus on their own self-improvement. Some of the things that every SOC analyst needs for their work is they need to have top quality training that focuses on current trends in security, right? It's not enough to point people to, Code Red and NIMDA anymore and say this is an example of an attack. It has to be focused on current trends. And then they need time to practice the skills that they learn in some sort of a lab environment, a safe environment where they can make mistakes, where they can test things, so that they understand what to look for when they get into the real world environment. So if you think about it, how can the SOC respond to a sophisticated, maybe even a unique 0-day attack if they don't have the capability to recognize one? How can they fine tune the analytic rules in their SIM to make their job more efficient if they don't really understand the capabilities of the tool that they're working with? So SOC analysts need to have bleeding edge training, and that's because their mission is to match or ideally exceed the skills of their adversaries. If they're always working at a disadvantage, working at a skill set that's far behind their adversaries, they're doomed to failure. So it's an important piece of the puzzle that tends to be underestimated in many organizations. So what are some tools that can help? Obviously, I work for Microsoft, so I'm going to look at it from the perspective of Microsoft tooling and so on. This is just an example that you can find in what we call the Cybersecurity Reference Architecture deck. It's very clear, just how broad the monitoring capabilities are within the Microsoft ecosystem, whether you're talking about in Azure, on the Windows endpoints, in Microsoft 365, but we can also extend that into third-party SaaS services or other providers like AWS and Google. So I'm not going to go into all the details on this slide, but the idea is you want to have tooling that can provide comprehensive monitoring for all the aspects of your environment. And that's really what this slide is also describing as well. We have visibility, but beyond that, we have to know where the weaknesses are. And so there are many Microsoft tools that will help you identify what the weaknesses are in your environment using the model of Secure Score and help you to identify where there are gaps or vulnerabilities in your environment. And this is certainly not the only type of tooling that does this sort of thing. It's just what I'm familiar with, and so that's what I'm sharing with you as an example. The last thing, or the third thing that we'll talk about here, is the need to integrate automation and orchestration into the SOC team's response to threats. So this is becoming one of the key differentiators between what you'd consider a well-run SOC and one that's just continuously inundated with alerts. How much of your process can you automate? Some people might think that automating processes runs the risk of putting your SOC team analysts out of a job, but that's just not the case, right? In fact, when the SOC team is able to automate responses to the kind of run-of-the-mill, commonly seen attacks, it actually improves the effectiveness of the SOC and frees up those analysts to uh, uh, take time to investigate the more complex threats and do some of that training that we talked about so that they can identify those more unique, novel types of attacks. So all this brings us to the real area of focus, why SOC teams miss things. And it comes down to fixing the people problem. So you've probably seen pictures of a security operations center in movies or TV shows, but in many cases, they don't represent the reality for your typical SOC analysts. They walk into the SOC on their first day of work and they maybe have this expectation that it's going to be something like what they've seen in the movies. It wouldn't be unreasonable for them to think, for example, that the tools work well, that the processes in the SOC are well defined, that generally the team is able to stay on top of the alerts that they receive. Of course, in many cases, that is true, but more often than not, it's not the case at all, right? It takes a lot of time before a SOC matures and figures out which tools and what processes work best for them. Even in the very best SOC environments, data flow tends to be very highly dialed in. Um, Tools work together very well. The alert queue stays low. Analysts are able to stay engaged with the threats in their environment. They're learning, they're happy, but that just isn't the case in every organization. In fact, things are usually far from optimal in many SOCs. Even if the SOC is relatively mature, even if they have good processes, even if the tools that are being used are good tools or industry accepted tools, chances are still good that there's some process, there's some tool, there's some workflow that's broken or that the analysts dislike. And most SOC teams will have at least one of those issues that you see listed on the slide here, whether the work is repetitive, there's no cooperation between teams, whatever it might be. So in some cases, it gets so bad that the SOC develops this reputation of being a place where you go, to serve your time for a year before you can escape onto, the job that you really want, right? It's just it's a stepping stone to get somewhere else. Now, if you think about it, if a job is a place that you're planning your escape from the first day that you walk in the door, it clearly isn't going to be a fun place to work, and people aren't going to stay, and they're not going to be motivated to do their best work while they're there. That leads us to burnout and stress. So burnout and stress are two factors that will definitely contribute to analysts making mistakes. Most people will use the word stress in a negative manner, and often stress is a negative. But there is such a thing as good stress, as we see in the picture. So stress itself isn't an emotion. It is your body's reaction to something that causes anxiety. So stress can be bad in some situations. So you see the gazelle, in the picture there, he's under bad stress. He's running for his life. But in other cases, it can be good, such as when it inspires us to get something done or to take on a difficult challenge. So the good stress is being felt by the lion because they're about to have a nice dinner, right? So bad stress is the type that either won't go away or it's so severe that it cripples our ability to act. And that tends to result in negative consequences of one type or another. What happens is if a situation feels like it's out of your control, bad stress kind of takes over. And that's the thing that can wear people down and lead to burnout, can lead to people being distracted from their job and from making mistakes. So, our goal then is to find a way to not necessarily eliminate stress, because that's not entirely possible, but try to eliminate the bad stressors and increase the things that cause good stress. So, what are the things that we can do to address this people problem? The first thing we'll talk about here is growth. So, how can we help the SOC team to develop intellectually? When a SOC team is learning and growing, they are solving unique issues, solving unique problems, and this can be done um, through on-the-job experience. So, for example, progressively giving your SOC analysts more difficult incidents to handle over time, assigning role models or allowing people to serve as mentors for others on the team can be a good way to help people to grow. And then non-repetitive tasks help people to develop creativity. So if someone is told to do the same thing the same way over and over and over again, not injecting any kind of creativity into the mix, that's going to lead to burnout and it's going to lead to mistakes. So you want to help build your employees' morale through a sense of accomplishment and a sense of growth. The second thing is very closely tied to that. So it's skill development. Now, why is this necessary? Well, because threats are changing daily. The methods of attack that are being used by nation states and crime organizations change every single day. They may change multiple times a day. And what that means is that we have to continually grow in our skills to combat or to counteract those types of attacks. People learn differently, however. Some people prefer to go to formal training, sit down, have an instructor talk to them. They work against a book or against a hands-on lab, and that's fine. Other people prefer to have a peer show them how to do something and to copy them in an on-the-job type of training. Purple and red teaming is a good way for teams to cross-pollinate within the organization and learn what does an attack look like? What does an attacker do to penetrate an environment so that I know what to look for when I'm on the other side, right? Tabletop exercises, and then this concept of train like you fight. Don't train people in a way that doesn't reflect reality, right? Yeah, when they get back to the SOC, they need to use the same skills that they learned in the classroom, use those same skills to combat the threats that they're facing. Empowerment. We hear often the phrase, just let me do my job. Don't tell me how to do every single thing. Let me do what I'm here to do. One of the frustrations that many SOC analysts will express is that they're asked to do a job, but then they don't have the permissions, they don't have the time, they're not given the funding to do that job well. And that can be very stressful for an individual. It can also be frustrating when the processes that they're expected to follow don't make sense or they're overly cumbersome. They spend all day documenting what they're doing instead of doing things. So another thing that's important and comes back to one of the topics that we mentioned earlier about visibility into the environment is you have to trust your analysts with the permissions that they need to access the environment. They have to be able to see the logging. They have to have the authority to act when they see something taking place in the environment. They shouldn't have to go through levels upon levels upon levels of management before anything is allowed to take place, because that just slows things down, and it decreases the motivation to tell anybody, right? Because it just becomes this onerous task that they're assigned to. And one of the things that's mentioned here, the last bullet point, is the ability to write new threat detection analytics. So give your analysts the ability to be creative and identify ways to find attackers. Don't tell them that they have to stick with what's been given to them and only that. Allow them the ability to be creative. Which brings us to the last point, creativity. How do you handle new and novel problems? Your analysts have to have the ability to go off script where needed. Now, we have playbooks. We may have incident response playbooks that we follow for a business email compromise, for a ransomware attack, and so on. But if something's unique, something's different, your analysts need to have the permission to try something different, to go off script and deviate from the playbook when it's necessary. That may lead them to develop new processes or improvements to existing processes, which is again good for the SOC overall as a team. So this is all related to the concept of empowerment. And you kind of see the flow of thought there in the last couple bullet points. If you're not empowered, then that means you're forced to stick to the playbook. Do only what's in the playbook. Don't deviate. Don't ask questions. Now, what happens if something comes up and it's not in the playbook? What are you supposed to do? Right? You have to give your people the license to solve problems in a creative way. So giving them a variety of tasks, a variety of things that they're allowed to work on, feeds that creativity and helps them become better at their job. So if we're going to sum this up, how do we describe the solution to this problem? There are definitely technology solutions that come into play when we try to identify why signals are missed. So we have to have good tools. We have to have good automation. Those are things that will help ensure that your SOC team isn't discouraged because they keep getting beat by the adversaries, right? We don't want to burden our SOC team with just repetitive, mind-numbing tasks that lead them to leave the organization because there's no room for creativity, no room for growth in the job. It all creates just negative pressure on them. But ultimately, the SOC team represents what we call human capital. And that means that you have to invest in your people in order for the SOC team to continue running well. When your SOC team experiences burnout, when you have high turnover rates on your SOC team, that is a human capital management problem. That is something that needs to be addressed by management. They need to recognize what the issues are and address those issues. It isn't that the people are bad. There's something broken in the system, and we need to find out what that is. The good way to start is provide opportunities for growth, enable your analysts to feel that they have the license to act in a way that may deviate from the playbook, invest in skills training for them, and give them the ability to grow and express their creativity. So if we have the tools, the technology, and we have the ability to create motivation among the humans that work on the SOC team, then the SOC as a whole will experience success. I certainly didn't come up with all this information on my own. There are some good links here that you may want to check out. I want to thank the writer of the SANS Sec 450 Blue Team Fundamentals uh, course. It was very useful in compiling this information. If you'd like to contact me, again, I can be reached on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect with anybody at all, and share your experiences and any questions that you might have, so that we can solve some of these problems together. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to talking to you soon.